They thought they could take what wasn't theirs. They thought that money, influence, and a carefully orchestrated homeowners association could rewrite the past, shift the boundaries, and erase generations of history. But what they didn't know was that the land they tried to steal carried a legacy too deeply rooted to be broken. For over 100 years, this lake, this dam, and every acre of the surrounding hills belonged to one family. And when outsiders tried to claim it, they learned the hard way what happens when greed collides with patience, precision, and the unstoppable force of nature. The story begins in the Appalachian Hill Country, a rugged landscape where dense forests roll into valleys and streams carve their way through ancient stone. It was here, almost a century ago, that a man named Angus MacLeod, my great-great-grandfather, changed the destiny of the land. In the 1920s, Angus, armed with little more than vision, grit, and a workforce of stonemasons, built a dam of cyclopean masonry. Massive stones, some weighing several tons, were locked together to form a wall that tamed the valley's river. Behind it, water swelled and spread, creating a vast man-made lake that shimmered across 700 acres. This wasn't just a lake. It was a reservoir of life and opportunity. It provided fishing, irrigation, and stability for the community. And through carefully drawn documents, deeds, and riparian rights, the dam and lake were placed under the stewardship of the MacLeod family trust. Over time, this trust grew into something sacred, a legal and moral anchor ensuring that no matter how the world changed, the land and water would remain in MacLeod hands. For 5 generations, my family upheld that trust. We managed the water levels, maintained the dam, and preserved the ecosystem surrounding the lake. We paid taxes on every acre of the 2,000-acre property. We invested in restoration after storms, cleared fallen trees, and fought erosion on the shoreline. This wasn't just land ownership. It was guardianship passed down like a torch. But the world around the lake did not remain untouched. Time marched forward, and with it came progress, money, and ambition. Just 3 years ago, a developer saw opportunity in the hills. They purchased land that bordered ours and announced plans for a new luxury-gated community called Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. From the beginning, it was clear they weren't just interested in their own land. They were interested in ours. The development sprouted quickly. Paved roads carved into hillsides, security gates erected at entrances, and advertisements boasting waterfront living with breathtaking views. But here was the problem. There was no waterfront property to sell. The lake did not belong to them. Every ripple, every drop, every inch of shoreline was under the MacLeod trust. That didn't stop them from trying. At first, their tactics seemed harmless. Residents from the new community began setting up picnic tables along the banks of the lake, claiming they believed it was shared access. A few paddle boats drifted into our waters, launched from unauthorized docks hammered into the soil. Then came fishing tournaments, banners posted as if the lake were theirs to promote. These were subtle intrusions, attempts to normalize the idea that the lake was public or, worse, controlled by the HOA. The heart of this operation was Brenda, the self-proclaimed president of Lakeview Pinnacle Estates Homeowners Association. Brenda embodied everything people imagine when they hear the word HOA Karen. She was loud, persistent, and completely convinced of her own authority. She strutted along the shoreline as though she were mayor of the water. Her words dripped with passive aggression, masking demands behind polite smiles. At first, it was suggestions about how the lake could be better maintained for everyone's enjoyment. Then came proposals to build shared recreation areas. What she truly wanted was control. But control wasn't hers to take. The real escalation came when survey maps began circulating, claiming the boundary lines placed portions of the lake within the HOA's jurisdiction. These maps didn't just shift a few feet of shoreline. They swallowed entire coves and inlets, amounting to nearly 50 acres of my family's property. The audacity was staggering. We soon discovered the maps had been produced by a disbarred surveyor hired by the developer, a man with a history of falsifying documents. It was fraud, plain and simple. Cease and desist orders were sent. Legal letters were drafted. But Brenda and the HOA pressed forward as if none of it mattered. Construction began on luxury cabins along the water's edge. 1 became 5. 5 became 20. Soon, an entire string of 139 cabins lined the shore, marketed as exclusive waterfront retreats. The HOA turned portions of my family's land into a so-called recreation area. Picnic shelters, fire pits, and even boat launches, all without permission. Every time I drove by, my stomach tightened. These cabins weren't just eyesores. They were violations of law, history, and trust. And worse, I knew something the HOA didn't. Something that would render every single cabin worthless. Because when my great-great-grandfather built the dam, he didn't just create a lake. He designed it with precision, planning for extremes. He knew water was unpredictable. To protect the dam, the shoreline, and the valley, he established a natural flood easement zone, 7 feet above the typical waterline. Within that buffer, nothing permanent was to be built. No houses, no docks, no cabins. And every single one of those new luxury cabins sat directly inside that buffer. The arrogance of the HOA had led them to build homes not on solid ground, but in the lake bed itself. They just didn't realize it yet. And that's when my training came into play. I wasn't just a landowner. I was a hydrological engineer. I had spent my career studying water systems, dam safety, and flood management. I knew the mechanics of the Mlaud Dam better than anyone alive. I had the original blueprints, the engineering notes, and the legal authority to operate it. The HOA thought they could fight me in board meetings and court filings, but they had no idea what was coming. Because the truth was simple. The cabins were illegal, unsanctioned, and fragile. All I had to do was return the lake to its natural high water mark, and nature itself would erase their trespass. The question wasn't if I would act. The question was when. And as the cabins multiplied and the HOA doubled down, that moment drew closer. When you're dealing with people like Brenda and her HOA, words mean nothing without proof. They would deny, twist, and gaslight their way through every conversation, pretending that wrong was right and theft was simply shared use. If I wanted to protect my family's legacy, I needed more than outrage. I needed undeniable evidence. The fight for the lake wasn't new to me. My grandfather had warned me decades earlier that someday, outsiders would come sniffing around, trying to claim what wasn't theirs. He told me then that the strongest weapon we had wasn't just the dam or the water but the paper trail left behind. Every survey, every deed, every blueprint. These were the anchors of truth. He made me promise that I would keep them safe, and I had. So, while the HOA hammered nails into their cabins, I began hammering together a case. My first stop was the Mlaud family archives, a dusty cedar trunk kept in the attic of my parents' farmhouse. Inside were bound folders of maps drawn in ink, original deed certificates from the 1800s, and handwritten notes from Angus himself. They were brittle with age but still powerful, carrying signatures of county clerks and stamps from registries long gone. These documents told the story clearly. The 2,000-acre property, including the man-made lake and the dam, belonged exclusively to the Mlaud family trust. The trust had been reaffirmed in multiple court filings over the decades, most recently after a flood in the 1970s, when the state tried to declare eminent domain. My great-uncle had fought that battle and won, proving once and for all that the dam and the water were private property. The rulings were still binding. Next, I pulled out the engineering records. Angus had been meticulous, recording every detail of the dam's construction. He documented stone sizes, mortar ratios, and water capacity levels. More importantly, he charted the 7-foot natural flood easement, an invisible line drawn across the landscape that dictated where water could legally rise. It was that line, set nearly a century ago, that now doomed every one of those cabins. I scanned every page into digital files, creating backups on hard drives and cloud storage. Redundancy was key. I knew the HOA would try to manipulate or dismiss paper documents, but there would be no arguing with certified digital copies and notarized originals. The more I pieced the puzzle together, the angrier I became, not because of what they were doing, but because of how deliberate it all was. The fraudulent survey maps weren't sloppy mistakes. They were calculated lies. The HOA had presented them at county meetings, citing them as justification for construction permits. Brenda herself had stood before township officials, waving those fake maps as if they were gospel. And while the county had raised eyebrows, they hadn't acted. Developers had money, and money spoke louder than suspicion. But I had something louder still. The truth backed by history, law, and nature. I hired a title attorney to review the chain of custody on the land. He cross-referenced the original deeds with county records, verifying that ownership had never changed hands. We even traced the tax payments back more than a century. Every year, without fail, the Mloud Family Trust had paid taxes on the full 2,000 acres. If there was ever proof of ownership, that was it. Still, Brenda's arrogance grew. By the time summer rolled around, the HOA was advertising lakefront rentals online. Weekend visitors showed up with kayaks strapped to their SUVs, dragging coolers down my shoreline. Families set up grills and lawn chairs on property they had no right to touch. I watched from a distance, documenting every intrusion with photos and time-stamped videos. Evidence, always evidence. My engineering background gave me another advantage. I pulled water level data from monitoring stations I had installed years earlier. Graphs showed precisely how the lake rose and fell through the seasons. These records proved that the HOA's cabins weren't just within the flood easement. They were already at risk. A single heavy storm could push the waterline high enough to lap at their foundations. It was only a matter of time before nature itself would deliver the proof they couldn't ignore. But I wasn't going to wait for storms. The dam had been built with control in mind. Hidden beneath its stone face were massive iron sluice gates, levers that dictated the release and retention of water. For generations, my family had used them responsibly, keeping the water steady for fishing and agriculture. Those gates gave me power, not just symbolic power, but real, physical control over the fate of the cabins. Yet this wasn't a decision to take lightly. Raising the waterline would destroy property, cause financial ruin, and unleash legal battles unlike anything I'd faced before. I needed to be certain, not only that I had the right, but that I could withstand the storm that would follow. So I gathered every scrap of evidence into binders, deeds, surveys, engineering diagrams, tax receipts, and environmental assessments. I wanted a record that no court, no judge, and no HOA board could deny. Then I called in an independent hydrologist. If Brenda or the developer tried to accuse me of reckless flooding, I needed a third-party expert to confirm that what I was doing was simply restoring the lake to its lawful capacity. The hydrologist walked the shoreline with me, shaking his head at the cabins. His report would later describe them as recklessly placed within a designated flood easement. His signature became another weapon in my arsenal. The HOA, of course, scoffed at all this. They dismissed the documents as outdated. They claimed the cabins were grandfathered in by county permits, despite the fact that those permits were obtained through fraudulent surveys. They even sent me threatening letters, accusing me of harassment for photographing their trespassing residents. But deep down, I knew they were nervous. Their bravado was a shield, a desperate attempt to cover the cracks forming in their story. And those cracks would soon split wide open, because evidence wasn't just paperwork in a binder. Evidence was the lake itself. Evidence was the waterline creeping closer to the cabins, inch by inch with every rainfall. Evidence was the sound of sluice gates groaning open, releasing power stored for generations. The question was no longer whether I could prove the cabins were illegal. The question was how far I was willing to go to enforce it. And as I stood on the dam one humid evening, binder in hand, the sun setting behind the hills, I realized I had already made my choice. The HOA thought they had won. They thought paperwork and intimidation could erase history. But they had underestimated two things: the iron will of a family who had guarded this land for over a century, and the silent, unstoppable force of the water behind the dam. The time for warnings was over. The time for action was near. The thing about water is that people forget it never truly belongs to anyone. You can fence off land, stake claims, draw boundaries on a map, but water doesn't respect paper. It moves where gravity tells it to move. It fills every hollow, creeps into every crack, and when it decides to rise, nothing built by human hands can hold it back. Standing on the dam, I felt that truth more clearly than ever. Behind me, the lake stretched for miles, calm and glassy in the summer heat. But beneath the surface it carried weight, pressure, and memory. My great-great-grandfather had known this when he designed the flood easement. He had left a warning carved into stone without ever writing the words, "Respect the water, or it will take back what is its own." The cabins the HOA had built were temporary illusions, pretty facades propped up on ground that had never truly been stable. They looked secure to the untrained eye, but every engineer knows appearances are lies. The soil beneath them had been compacted poorly, sitting low in the easement zone. Their foundations were shallow. Their stilts sank unevenly into earth that had been damp for decades. These weren't homes. They were accidents waiting to happen. But I didn't want accidents. I wanted clarity. If nature was going to reclaim the land, it needed to happen under control, my control. And so preparation began. The dam had 3 main sluice gates, each a relic of early 20th century engineering. Iron wheels connected to gears, gears connected to chains, and chains descended into the stone belly of the structure, pulling up massive wooden panels that regulated the outflow of water. My grandfather used to joke that operating them was like waking up an old dragon. You had to do it carefully, or it would roar too loud. For years, we had kept the lake at a moderate level, never pushing it close to the 7-foot mark unless storms forced our hand. The cabins, foolishly, had been built just 4 feet above that usual line. That meant I didn't even need to bring the lake to its maximum. Raising it a modest 3 feet would be enough to lap at their doorsteps. Another 2, and water would seep into their walls. A full 7-foot rise would swallow entire rows, pulling porches and stilts into the waves. But raising the water wasn't just a matter of cranking a wheel. It was science, patience, and timing. Too fast, and I risked structural strain on the dam. Too slow, and the HOA would notice what I was doing and scramble for court injunctions. I needed to be methodical, quiet, and precise. The first step was calibration. I checked the monitoring gauges, ensuring their readings matched my calculations. The data showed we were at a summer low, perfect conditions to begin storing water. I closed one of the outflow gates halfway, reducing the release downstream. Almost immediately, the lake began to respond, but in subtle ways only an engineer would notice. Ripples gathering heavier along the banks, small coves darkening as water crept further inland. From the shoreline, residents of the cabins probably thought nothing of it. A little rain, a little swelling, nothing unusual. But I knew. I saw the pattern, and I documented every inch the waterline gained. While the lake rose, I kept working my paper trail. More surveys were filed. More photographs taken. I hired a drone pilot to capture aerial footage of the shoreline. From above, it was undeniable. The cabins were inside the buffer zone. The footage showed water inching closer to decks and patios, each frame timestamped, each file stored redundantly. At the same time, I prepared for the inevitable confrontation. I knew Brenda would come storming when the first drops of water touched her precious cabins. She thrived on spectacle, always ready to weaponize outrage. That was why I needed my binders, my expert reports, my historical evidence all lined up in perfect order. When she came with accusations, I would meet her with facts. And when she came with threats, I would meet her with silence, letting the lake itself answer for me. By late August, the water had risen nearly 2 feet. To most, the change was invisible, hidden in reeds and rocky inlets. But on one cabin, I noticed the shift clearly. A deck chair that had once sat a safe distance from shore now rested in shallow water. Guests who came for a weekend getaway dragged their coolers a little higher up the bank, probably annoyed but unaware that they were standing inside a ticking clock. And that clock kept counting down. September brought heavy rains, the kind that roll in from the hills with sudden violence. Thunder cracked, trees bent, and the lake swelled. I didn't fight it. I let the dam hold, sluice gates tight. Every drop became mine to keep, every gallon adding weight to my argument. By the end of the storm, the lake had gained another foot, and the cabins sat uncomfortably close to the encroaching waterline. It wasn't destruction yet, not even damage, just a whisper of what was coming. A warning in the language of water. The HOA, of course, didn't see it that way. They called it seasonal variation. Brenda even boasted in a newsletter that the community had weathered the storm beautifully. She wrote about resilience, about how the lake was an asset, about how the cabins offered unparalleled access to natural beauty. Reading her words, I almost laughed. She had no idea that her so-called resilience was nothing more than my restraint. Because the truth was, I hadn't even brought the water to half its potential. I was still holding back, still waiting. The time wasn't right, not yet. In the meantime, I strengthened my position. I met with my attorney to review liability laws. As dam owner, I had the right to maintain water at its designated high water mark. That was the key phrase, designated. It wasn't an arbitrary line but a legally recorded elevation etched into engineering records and upheld in past court rulings. As long as I stayed within that mark, I was unassailable. And so I planned the final phase, the push that would bring the lake to its rightful boundary, the moment that would silence every argument, every fraudulent survey, every smug smile from Brenda. It wasn't revenge I was seeking. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was correction, restoring balance to what had been thrown out of order. By October, the preparations were complete. The binders were airtight. The gauges were steady. The sluice gates were ready. The water waited, calm and obedient, behind walls of stone laid nearly a century ago. The HOA believed they had won, parading renters through cabins and hosting barbecues on stolen land. But they didn't realize they were standing inside a bathtub whose drain I controlled. And soon I would stop holding back. By the time October's chill settled in, the waterline had advanced far enough to erase the illusion. The cabins still stood, but the ground beneath them was no longer dry. Porch steps ended in muck, and grass lawns had transformed into soggy marsh. It was subtle to everyone but me. To me, it was the sound of truth surfacing. The first complaints came quietly. A cabin owner left a voicemail about erosion issues. Another emailed blurry photos of puddles beneath their deck. They weren't accusatory yet, just confused. They wanted answers, reassurance, maybe even sympathy. They wanted someone to tell them this was temporary. That was Brenda's role, and she delivered. At the next HOA gathering, she stood at the front of their community lodge, speaking with her usual authority. She called the rising water a seasonal quirk. She claimed natural wetlands were adjusting after heavy storms. She promised homeowners that their investments were safe, that the board was working tirelessly to coordinate with state agencies. None of it was true. I know because I watched that meeting myself. They had streamed it on Facebook, bragging about transparent governance. What they didn't realize was that their transparency was my entertainment. I listened as Brenda spun her narrative, every word clashing against the data in my binders. But cracks had already begun to show. One man raised his hand and asked whether the cabins had been built too close to the water. Another woman wondered why her basement sump pump had run for days straight. Brenda brushed them off with charm and disdain, laughing as though the concerns were silly. But the unease lingered. It was in the faces of the audience, in the way some avoided eye contact, in the way others whispered after the meeting. Doubt is like rot. Once it starts, it spreads. Meanwhile, I kept documenting. Every week, I took new photos from the shoreline and from above. Drone footage captured cabin foundations now surrounded by waterlogged earth. One particularly telling shot showed a fire pit, once ringed with stones and chairs, submerged halfway, only the tops of the rocks peeking above the lake's surface. That image became my favorite. Nothing explains inevitability like water swallowing a circle of stones. By mid-October, the water had risen 3 feet. That was the tipping point. No more seasonal variation. No more excuses. The cabins were indisputably inside the flood zone, and the residents began to panic. Brenda, of course, doubled down. She went on a local radio show calling me out directly. The dam operator, she said, spitting the title like poison, is manipulating the water levels out of spite. He's weaponizing the lake against law-abiding residents. Her words might have stung if they weren't so weak. Law-abiding? I had the law on my side. manipulating. I was simply restoring the lake to its designated line. Spite? Spite was her specialty, not mine. I didn't call in to correct her. I didn't send rebuttals. I didn't need to, because while she spoke into microphones, the water spoke louder. The downstream flow was steady, carefully calculated. The upstream rise was relentless, inches accumulating without fanfare. I moved deliberately, just enough to make progress without drawing accusations of sabotage. Nature itself carried out the work for me. Storms swelled the inflows. Cold nights slowed evaporation. I simply held the gate steady and let physics prove my case. Then the first real damage appeared. It was Cabin 14, a 2-story rental that had been marketed online as a luxury lakeside retreat. Guests arrived expecting Instagram-worthy sunsets. What they found instead was water lapping against the lower steps, mosquitoes breeding in the soggy lawn, and a musty smell rising from the crawl space. They left after 2 nights. Their online review was brutal. False advertising. This is not lakefront. This is lake in your front yard. The HOA tried to have the review removed. They failed. The internet, unlike Brenda, did not bend to her charm. More reviews followed. Words like flooded, unsafe, and mold began appearing next to glossy real estate photos that had once sold the dream. Renters canceled bookings. Owners demanded answers. Insurance adjusters started circling like vultures. Brenda grew louder, desperate. She organized an emergency HOA vote to sue me personally. She drafted a resolution accusing me of malicious mismanagement. She even claimed the dam itself was outdated and dangerous. That was a mistake, because when you accuse the dam, you invite state engineers to inspect it. And when state engineers inspect it, they don't just look at concrete and iron. They look at maps, records, boundaries, elevations. When they came, I welcomed them. I handed them copies of my grandfather's original survey. I showed them the flood easement lines carved into official documents. I let them walk the shoreline and see for themselves. I didn't have to convince them of anything. The lake did the convincing for me. And when their report came back, it was a death sentence for Brenda's narrative. The cabins were confirmed to be within the designated flood zone. The dam was confirmed to be structurally sound. And the water level? Still below maximum allowance. The HOA had no case. But Brenda didn't accept that. She never would. For her, this wasn't about law or safety, it was about pride. To admit defeat would mean admitting she had been wrong from the beginning, that her empire was built on sand. And so, she did what desperate people always do. She escalated. She called a rally. Flyers went out. Posts spread online. Homeowners, renters, and anyone willing to listen were invited to gather at the shoreline for a community defense. She framed it as a stand against tyranny, against abuse of power, against me. I stood on the dam that evening, watching the crowd gather. Dozens of them, maybe more. They carried signs. They chanted slogans. They hurled accusations across the water, their voices rising in the twilight. But while they raged, the lake was patient, silent, unmoved. And as the sun set, the waterline crept another half-inch higher, soaking the shoes of those who dared stand too close. They didn't notice at first. They were too busy shouting. But they would. Soon enough they would. Because you can scream at a man all you want, but you can't scream at water. The rally was supposed to be Brenda's triumph. She had advertised it as the moment the community stood united. A show of strength against what she called lake tyranny. But rallies do not stop physics. Shouting does not lower water. And pride does not build higher ground. By early November, the lake was brushing the 7-foot buffer line, the very elevation Angus M'Leod had marked a century earlier in his dam blueprints. The cabins, gleaming with their false luxury just months before, now stood like stranded ships, their foundations swallowed by the encroaching lake. It began with the roads. The private lanes leading into the development, once touted as scenic drives, turned into muddy channels. Tires sank deep. Delivery trucks refused to enter. Garbage collection stopped altogether, leaving overflowing bins as the first visual scar of decline. Next came the utilities. Water seeped into electrical conduits buried too shallow beneath the soil. Junction boxes sparked and failed. At first, it was just flickering lights in a few cabins. Then it was entire rows losing power. A single storm knocked out their grid for 3 days, leaving residents burning candles in homes advertised as state-of-the-art. Brenda called it sabotage. She told anyone who would listen that I was tampering with the water releases, that I was deliberately endangering families. But no inspector could find fault. Every measurement at the dam showed compliance. Every inch of water sat within legal right. And the inspectors reminded her, repeatedly, that the cabins were never supposed to be there at all. That truth, though, didn't quiet her. It only made her louder. But her words couldn't dry carpets or restore cracked foundations. And when the first real flood came, even she could not deny what had happened. It arrived not as a storm, not as a violent event, but as inevitability. Steady rains, swollen tributaries, and my steady hand at the dam combined to bring the lake to full pool. It rose calmly, silently, like a curtain being drawn, and then it spilled into the cabins. Cabin 14, already half condemned by mildew, became the first casualty. Its deck posts gave way overnight, collapsing the porch into the rising water. A neighbor found it floating the next morning like driftwood, half submerged, tethered only by warped nails. Within days, more followed. Crawl spaces filled with dark water. Flooring buckled upward, pushing furniture against walls. Carpets turned to sponges. Mold spread unchecked. The cabins, so meticulously staged for brochures, became symbols of neglect and ruin. The renters vanished. The owners tried denial. Some brought in sandbags. Others attempted to pump basements dry, running noisy generators around the clock. But the pumps ran in vain. The water always returned, creeping through cracks and seams, a patient invader that knew no exhaustion. Drone footage of the devastation spread faster than any HOA memo. Photos leaked onto local news. Glossy luxury cabins standing in waist-deep water, Adirondack chairs floating like debris, a golf cart drowned beneath the surface. The story shifted overnight. It was no longer about community pride or neighborly spirit. It was about greed, deception, and hubris. Brenda panicked. She appeared on television, her once confident tone brittle. She claimed the lake was being weaponized. She accused me of destroying lives. But her voice wavered. And worse, her own neighbors had begun to turn against her. The lawsuits came next, not against me but against the HOA. Cabin owners filed complaints of fraud and negligence. They accused Brenda and her board of ignoring warnings, of knowingly approving construction in a floodplain. They demanded refunds, repairs, compensation. The HOA's legal fund, bloated from dues and developer subsidies, drained rapidly. Attorneys cost money. So did cleanup attempts. So did constant PR damage control. And as the coffers emptied, so too did Brenda's grip on authority. But the lake wasn't done. The flood that November wasn't dramatic. It wasn't catastrophic. It was quiet, steady, methodical, nature's handwriting scrawled across false maps. But then December brought a storm. Not a monster, not even historic, but enough. Enough rain to push the lake half a foot higher than its typical pool. Enough to erase any illusion of safety. That night, the cabins weren't just soggy. They were underwater. The lower levels vanished first. Deck railings disappeared beneath rippling black waves. Windows shattered under pressure. Propane tanks bobbed loose from their moorings, drifting like deadly buoys. The once picturesque development looked less like a neighborhood and more like a shipyard swallowed by the sea. I stood on the dam in the dark, flashlight in hand, rain pelting my jacket. The roar of water spilling through the overflow drowned out distant shouts from the community. It was not triumph I felt. It was inevitability. Justice had no need for anger. Nature had written the ending long before Brenda wrote her first fraudulent map. By dawn, the destruction was irreversible. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing sweeping footage that would air on every local channel. The story could no longer be spun as a feud. It was a scandal. Reporters swarmed the area. They interviewed soaked homeowners, faces drawn with despair. They interviewed county officials, who shrugged and pointed at the HOA. They even tried to interview Brenda, but she slammed her door and refused. It was the beginning of the end. Within weeks, the developer behind Lakeview Pinnacle Estates filed for bankruptcy protection. Their glossy website went dark. Their sales office shuttered. And the HOA, stripped of funds and credibility, faced a mountain of lawsuits it could never hope to climb. The cabins stood abandoned, skeletons on the shoreline, waterlogged monuments to arrogance. And through it all, the lake remained calm. Not malicious, not vengeful, simply present, simply full. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had risen, foot by foot, until even the loudest voices could no longer deny it. But there was still one chapter left to write. Because while the cabins were ruined, the land beneath them remained scarred. Cleanup was coming. Restoration was coming. And I knew, as custodian of this water and this history, that responsibility would fall not on Brenda, not on her crumbling HOA, but on me. The reckoning had arrived. Justice had been delivered. But the work, the real work, was only just beginning. The cabins did not vanish overnight. Their remains lingered, half drowned and half forgotten, as if clinging stubbornly to the illusion of permanence. Roof lines jutted above the waterline like broken teeth, while warped siding peeled away in ragged sheets. For months, the shoreline looked more like a junkyard than the manicured resort community the brochures had once promised. But just as the water had risen with patience, so too did its reclamation demand patience. Lawsuits dragged on. The HOA, now leaderless after Brenda's resignation, was legally dissolved. The developer's bankruptcy hearings revealed layer upon layer of deception, fraudulent surveys, falsified permits, even shell companies designed to funnel liability away from those truly responsible. Yet when the legal smoke cleared, there was no one left to pay the bill. No funds, no insurance coverage, no cleanup crews arriving with heavy equipment. Responsibility fell where it always had, on the family who had built the lake, maintained it, and understood its power. On me. The decision was not easy. I had already spent years battling lies, schemes, and harassment. I had every reason to walk away, to let the wreckage rot as a warning. But I could not. The lake was more than property. It was heritage, entrusted to me by generations who had safeguarded it long before Brenda's HOA ever existed. And if I left those cabins to crumble, the damage would not only scar the shoreline, it would poison the water, the soil, and the legacy itself. So I began the long work of restoration. The first step was removal. I hired crews, quiet, practical workers with no interest in drama, to dismantle what the flood had broken. They cut beams into sections, hauled twisted appliances onto barges, and carried mold-soaked furniture piece by piece out of the shallows. It was expensive. Some days I questioned the cost. But each load that left the lake was like clearing away a lie, restoring a little more truth to the land. The cabins went down one after another. Their hollow shells crumbled easily, lacking the foundations they had once boasted about. By spring, only scattered pilings and patches of disturbed earth remained, silent evidence of arrogance erased. Next came renewal. The banks where decks and driveways had once sat were reseeded with native grasses. Erosion control mats held the soil in place while saplings rooted themselves along the waterline. I brought in aquatic specialists who reintroduced native plants into the shallows, repairing habitats disrupted by construction. The lake responded almost immediately. Herons returned to stalk minnows. Frogs croaked along the reeds at night. The water, once clouded with silt from careless grading, cleared until it mirrored the sky. And all the while, I worked from the dam, monitoring flows, adjusting levels, ensuring stability. The same blueprints Angus M'Leod had drawn a century ago guided my hand. His design had been sound then, and it remained sound now. Every turn of the wheel, every measurement on the gauge, was an echo of his foresight. The community beyond the gates of Lakeview Pinnacle Estates changed too. With the HOA dissolved and the developer gone, what remained were individuals. Families who had been misled, investors who had lost everything, renters who had never asked for conflict. Some left quietly, abandoning their half-paid cabins to foreclosure. Others stayed, humbled and quieter, their grand ambitions replaced with caution. Brenda herself vanished from view. Her house, once the epicenter of HOA meetings and declarations, was sold under court order. Rumors spread of her moving in with relatives in another state. I never saw her again. In truth, I did not need to. The lake had spoken more clearly than any confrontation could. By the following summer, the land looked almost as it had in my grandfather's day. The shoreline curved naturally once more, grasses swaying where driveways had cut scars. Fishermen returned with boats, grateful for waters free of trespassing disputes. Neighbors picnicked on the banks, no longer afraid of HOA letters demanding fines for unauthorized use. Peace settled over the water. Yet it was not just peace that lingered, it was perspective. This entire ordeal had reminded me that land is not merely dirt to be bought and sold, nor water simply an amenity to market. It is inheritance, responsibility, and power. My family had not maintained this place for profit, but for continuity, for history, for the knowledge that nature, when respected, provides abundance, and when ignored, delivers justice. The cabins had been marketed as waterfront living. In the end, they had indeed become waterfront, consumed by the very lake they tried to exploit. People often ask what satisfaction I took from it all. The answer is simple: none. There was no joy in seeing families displaced, in watching homes collapse. But there was justice, there was balance, and there was truth restored. The final stage of restoration came in the fall of the second year. With debris cleared and native plants thriving, I opened the banks for a community celebration. Not an HOA event, not a developer's showcase, but a gathering of neighbors who respected the land as it was. We grilled food by the shore. Children skipped stones across the water. Elders told stories of when the lake was first filled. And for the first time in years, there were no disputes, no fraudulent maps, no shouting about rights. Only belonging. As the sun set that evening, casting the water in gold, I walked to the top of the dam. I placed a hand on the weathered stones Angus had laid generations ago, stones that had outlasted every lie, every scheme, every cabin built on shifting ground. The message was clear. Legacies endure not through force, but through patience. Not through shouting, but through proof. And when challenged, they do not crumble. They rise, as steady and inevitable as the water itself. The lake is full again now, brimming to its designed high mark, calm and watchful. And with it, the family legacy remains intact, flowing forward like the streams that feed it, ready for another 100 years. The cabins are gone. The HOA is gone. The fraud is gone. But the lake remains, always the lake, and in the stillness of its waters, justice lives.